Chapter 13, Part 1 of The Scouts of Stonewall. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Scouts of Stonewall by Joseph A. Altsheler. Chapter 13, The Sullen Retreat, Part 1. Harry, like the rest of the army, slept soundly through the rest of the night, and they rose to a brilliant first day of June. The scouts said that the whole force of Fremont was not far behind, while the army of Shields was marching on a parallel line east of the Massanuttons, and ready at the first chance to form a junction with Fremont. Youth seeks youth, and Harry and Dalton found a little time to talk with St. Clair and Langdon. "We've broken their ring and passed through," said Langdon, "but as sure as we live we'll all be fighting again in a day. If the Yankees follow too hard, old Jack will turn and fight 'em. Now why haven't the Yankees got sense enough to let us alone and go home?" "They'll never do it," said Dalton gravely. "We've got to recognize that fact. I'm never going to say another word about the Yankees not being willing to fight." "They're too darned willing," said Happy Tom. "That's the trouble." "I woke up just about the dawn," said Dalton. "Everybody was asleep but the general, and I saw him praying." "Then it means fighting, and lots of it," said St. Clair. "I'm going to make the best use I can of this little bit of rest, as I don't expect another chance for at least a month. Stonewall Jackson thinks that 1 hour a day for play keeps Jack from being a dull boy." "Just look at our colonels, will you?" said Happy Tom. "They're believers in what Arthur says." Colonel Leonidas Talbot and Lieutenant Colonel Hector St. Hilaire were sitting in a corner of a rail fence opposite each other, and their bent gray heads nearly touched, but their eyes were on a small board between them, and now and then they moved carved figures back and forth. "They're playing chess," whispered Happy Tom. "They found the board and a set of men and the captured baggage, and this is their first chance to use them." "They can't possibly finish a game," said Harry. "No," said Tom, "they can't, and it's just as well. Why anybody wants to play chess is more than I can understand. I'd rather watch a 4-mile race between two turtles. It's a lot swifter and more thrilling." "It takes intelligence to play chess, Happy," said St. Clair. "And time, too," rejoined Happy. "If a thing consumes a lifetime anyway, what's the use of intelligence?" A bugle sounded. The two colonels raised their gray heads and gave the chessmen and the board to an orderly. The four boys returned to their horses, and in a few minutes Jackson's army was once more on the march, the Acadian band near the head of the column playing as joyously as if it had never lost a member in battle. The mountains and the valley between were bathed in light once more. The heavy dark green foliage on the slopes of the Massanuttons rested the eye, and the green fields of the valley were cheering. "I don't believe I'd ever forget this valley if I lived to be 1,000, said Harry. "I've marched up and down it so much, and every second of the time was so full of excitement." "Here's one day of peace, or at least it looks so," said Dalton. But Jackson beckoned to Harry, bade him ride to the rear and report if there was any sign of the enemy. They had learned to obey quickly, and Harry galloped back by the side of the marching army. Even now the men were irrepressible, and he was saluted with the old familiar cries. "Hey, Johnny Reb, come back! You're going toward the Yankees, not away from him." "Let him go ahead, Bill. He's going to tell the Yankees to stop or he'll hurt 'em." "That ain't the way to ride a horse, bub. Don't sit up so straight in the saddle." Harry paid no attention to this disregard of his dignity as an officer. He had long since become used to it, and if they enjoyed it, he was glad to furnish the excuse. He reached the rear guard of scouts and skirmishers, and turning his horse, kept with them for a while, but they saw nothing. Sherburne, with a detachment of the cavalry, was there, and Ashby, who commanded all the horsemen, often appeared. "Fremont's army is not many miles behind," said Sherburne. "If we were to ride a mile or two toward it, we could see its dust. But the Yanks are tired, and they can't march fast. I wish I knew how far up the Luray Shields and his army are. We've got to look out for that junction of Shields and Fremont." "We'll pass the gap before they can make the junction," said Harry confidently. "How's old Jack looking?" "Same as ever. That is, like a human sphinx. Well, you can never tell from his face what he's thinking, but you can be sure that he's thinking something worthwhile. You think then I can report to him that the pursuit will not catch up today? I'm sure of it. I've talked with Ashby also about it, and he says they're yet too far back. Harry, what day is this?" Harry smiled at the sudden question, but he understood how Sherborne, amid almost continuous battle, had lost sight of time. "I heard someone say it was the 1st of June," he replied. "No later than that? Why, it seemed to me that it must be nearly autumn. Do you know, Harry, that on this very day 2 years ago I was up there in those mountains to the west with a jolly camping party? I was just a boy then, and now here I am, an old man. About 23, I should say." "A good guess. But anyway, I've been through enough to make me feel 60. I promise you, Harry, that if I ever get through this war alive, I'll shoot the man who tries to start another. Look at the fields, how fine and green they are. Think of all that good land being torn up by the hoofs of cavalry and the wheels of cannon. If you're going to be sentimental, I'll leave you," said Harry, and the action followed the word. He rode away because he was afraid he would grow sentimental himself. The army continued its peaceful march up the valley, and most of the night that followed. Harry was allowed to obtain a few hours' sleep in the latter part of the night in one of the captured wagons. It was a covered wagon, and he selected it because he noticed that the night, even if it was the 1st of June, was growing chill. But he had no time to be particular about the rest. He did not undress. He had not undressed in days, but lying between 2 sacks of meal, with his head on a 3rd sack, he sank into a profound slumber. When Harry awoke, he felt that the wagon was moving. He also heard the patter of rain on his canvas roof. It was dusky in there, but he saw in front of him the broad back of the teamster who sat on the cross seat and drove. "Hello!" exclaimed Harry, sitting up. "What's happened?" A broad red face was turned to him, and a voice issuing from a slit almost all the way across its breadth replied, "Well, if little old Rip Van Winkle himself hadn't waked up at last! Why, you've slept nigh on to 4 hours, and nobody in Stonewall Jackson's army is ever expected to sleep more'n 3, and that's gospel truth, as sure's my name is Sam Martin." "But, Sam, you don't tell me what's happened." "It's as simple as ABC. We're moving again, and that fine June day yesterday that we liked so much is gone forever. The 2nd of June ain't one little bit like the 1st of June. It's cold and it's wet. Can't you hear the rain pelting on the canvas? Besides, the Yanks are coming up too. I done heard the booming of cannon off there toward the rear. Oh, why wasn't I called? Here I am sleeping away, and the enemy is already in touch with us. Don't you worry about that, sonny. Don't you be so anxious to get into a fight, 'cause you'll have plenty of chances when you can't keep out of it. 'Sides, General Jackson ain't been expecting you. We're up near the head of the line, and about an hour ago, when we was starting, a whiskered man on a little sorrel horse rid up and said, 'Which of my staff have you got in there? I remember signing one to you last night.' I bows very low, and I says, 'General Jackson, I don't know his name.' He was too sleepy to give it. But he's a real young feller, nice and quiet. He ain't give no trouble at all. He's been sleeping so hard I think he's pounded his ear clean through one of them bags of meal. General Jackson laughs low and just a little, and then he takes a peek into the wagon. 'Why, it's young Harry Kenton,' he says. 'Let him sleep on till he wakes. He deserves it.' Then he lets fall the canvas, and he ups and rides away. And if I was in your place, young Mr. Kenton, I'd feel mighty proud to have Stonewall Jackson say that I deserved more rest." "I am proud, but I've got to go now. I don't know where I'll find my horse." "I know, and what's more I'll tell. An orderly came back with him, saddled and bridled, and he's hitched to this here wagon of mine. Good-bye, Mr. Kenton. I'm sorry you're going, 'cause you've been a nice, pleasant boarder, saying nothing and giving no trouble." Harry thanked him, then in an instant was out of the wagon and on his horse. It required only a few minutes to overtake Jackson and his staff, who were riding soberly along in the rain. He noticed with relief that he was not the last to join the chief. 2 or 3 others came up later. Jackson nodded pleasantly to them all as they came. But the morning was gloomy in the extreme. Harry was glad to shelter himself with a heavy cavalry cloak from the cold rain. All the skies were covered with sullen clouds, and the troops trudged silently on in deep mud. Now and then a wind off the mountains threshed the rain sharply into their faces. From the rear came the deep, sullen mutter which Harry so readily recognized as the sound of the big guns. Sam Martin was right. The enemy was most decidedly in touch. Dalton handed Harry some cold food, and he ate it in the saddle. Jackson rode on, saying nothing, his head bowed a little, his gaze far away. The officers of his staff were also silent. Jackson, after a while, reined his horse out of the road, and his staff, of course, followed. The troops filed past, and Jackson said, "We will soon pass the gap in the Massanuttons, and Shields cannot come out there ahead of us. That danger is left behind." "What of the junction between Shields and Fremont, General?" asked one of the older officers. Jackson cast one glance at the somber heavens. "Providence favors us," he said. "The South Fork of the Shenandoah flows between Fremont and Shields. It is swollen already by the rains and the rushing torrents from the mountains, and if I read the skies right, we're going to have other long and heavy rains. They can't ford the Shenandoah, and they can't stop to bridge it. It will be a long time before they can bring a united force against us." But while he spoke, the mutter of the guns grew louder. Jackson listened attentively a long time, and then sent several of his staff officers to the rear with orders to the cavalry, the Invincibles under Talbot, and one other regiment, to hold the enemy off at all costs. As Harry galloped back, the mutter of the cannon grew into thunder. There was also the sharper crash of rifle fire. Presently he saw the flash of the firing and numerous spires of smoke rising. His own message was to the Invincibles, and he delivered the brief note to Colonel Talbot, who read it quickly and then tore it up. "Stay with us a while, Harry," he said, "and you can then report more fully to the general what is going on. They crowd us hard. Look how their sharpshooters are swarming in the woods and fields yonder." An orchard to the left of the road, and only a short distance away, was filled with the Union riflemen, running from tree to tree and along the fences. They sent bullets straight into the ranks of the Invincibles. 4 guns were turned and swept the orchard with shell. But the wary sharpshooters darted to another point, and again came the hail of bullets. Colonel Talbot bade his weary men turn, but at the moment Sherburne, with a troop of cavalry, swept down on the riflemen and sent them flying. Harry saw Colonel Talbot's lips moving, and he knew that he was murmuring thanks, because Sherburne had come so opportunely. "We're not having an easy time," he said to Harry. "They press us hard. We've driven them back for a time, and they come again. They have field guns, too, and they are handled with great skill. If I do not mistake greatly, they are under the charge of Carrington, who, you remember, fought us at that fort in the valley before Bull Run. John Carrington. Old John Carrington, my classmate at West Point, a man who wouldn't hurt a fly, but who was the most deadly artillery officer in the world." Harry remembered that famous duel of the guns in the hills, and Colonel Talbot's admiration of his opponent, Carrington. Now he could see it shining in his eyes as strongly as ever. "Why are you so sure, Colonel, that it's Carrington?" he asked. "Because nobody else could handle those field guns as he does. He brings them up, sends the shot and shell upon us, then hitches up like lightning, is away before we can charge, and in a minute or two is firing into our line elsewhere. Trust Carrington for such work, and I'm glad he hasn't been killed. John's the dearest soul in the world, as gentle as a woman. Down, 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 all of you! There are the muzzles of his guns in the bushes again." Colonel Talbot's order was so sharp and convincing that most of the Invincibles mechanically threw themselves upon their faces, just as 4 field pieces crashed and the shell and shrapnel flew over their heads. That rapid order had saved them, but the officers on horseback were not so lucky. A captain was killed, Lieutenant Colonel St. Hilaire was grazed on the shoulder, and the horse of Colonel Talbot was killed under him. But Colonel Talbot, alert and agile despite his years, sprang clear of the falling horse and said emphatically to his second in command, Lieutenant Colonel Hector St. Hilaire, "The last doubt is gone. It's Carrington as sure as we live." Then he gave a quick order to his men to rise and fire with the rifles, but the woods protected the gunners, and when Sherburne with his cavalry charged into the forest, Carrington and his guns were gone. End of chapter 13, part 1. Chapter 13, part 2 of The Scouts of Stonewall. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Scouts of Stonewall by Joseph A. Altsheler. Chapter 13, The Sullen Retreat, Part 2. Colonel Talbot procured another horse, and the Invincibles, sore of body and mind, resumed their slow and sullen retreat. Harry left them and rode further along the front of the rear guard. Under the somber skies and in the dripping rain, there was a long line of flashing rifles and the flaming of big guns at intervals. Fremont was pushing the pursuit, and pushing it hard. Harry recognized anew the surpassing skill of Jackson in keeping his enemies separated by mountains and streams, while his own concentrated force marched on. He felt that Fremont would hold Jackson in battle if he could, until the other Northern armies came up. And he felt also that Jackson would lead Fremont beyond a junction with the others, and then turn. Yet these Northern men were certainly annoying. They did not seem to mind defeats. Here they were, fighting as hard as ever, pursuing and not pursued. Harry, turning to the left, saw a numerous body of cavalry under Ashby, supported by guns also, and he joined them. Ashby, on his famous white horse, was riding here and there, exposing himself again and again to the fire of the enemy, who was pressing close. He nodded to Harry, whom he knew. "You can report to General Jackson," he said, "that the enemy is continually attacking, but that we are continually beating him off." Just as he spoke, a trumpet sounded loud and clear in the edge of a wood only 300 or 400 yards away. There was a tremendous shout from many men, and then the thunder of hoofs. A cavalry detachment, more than 1,000 strong, rushed down upon them, and to right and left of the horsemen, regiments of infantry, supported by field batteries, charged also. The movement was so sudden, so violent, and so well conceived, that Ashby's troops were swept away, despite every effort of the leader, who galloped back and forth on his white horse, begging them to stand. So powerful was the rush that the cavalry were finally driven in retreat, and with them the Invincibles. Some of the troops, worn by battles and marches until the will weakened with the body, broke and ran up the road. Harry heard behind him the triumphant shouts of their pursuers, and he saw the Northern bayonets gleaming as they came on in masses. Ashby was imploring his men to stand, but they would not. The columns pressing upon them were too heavy, and they scarcely had strength enough left to fight. More and yet more troops came into battle. The Northern success for the time was undoubted. The men in blue were driving in the Southern rear guard, and Ashby was unable to hold the road. But the two colonels at last succeeded in drawing the Invincibles across the turnpike, where they knelt in good order and sent volley after volley into the pursuing ranks. Fremont's men wavered and then stopped, and Ashby, upbraiding his horsemen and calling their attention to the resolute stand of the infantry, brought them into action again. Infantry and cavalry, then uniting, drove back the Northern vanguard, and for the time being the Southern rear guard was safe once more. But the Invincibles and the cavalry were almost exhausted. Harry found St. Clair wounded, not badly, but with enough loss of blood for Colonel Talbot to send him to one of the wagons. He insisted that he was still fit to help hold the road, but Colonel Talbot ordered 2 of the soldiers to put him in the wagon, and he was compelled to submit. "We can't let you die now from loss of blood, you young fire-eater," said Colonel Talbot severely, "because you may be able to serve us better by getting killed later on." St. Clair smiled wanly, and with his formal South Carolina politeness said, "Thanks, sir. It helps a lot when you're able to put it in such a satisfactory way." Harry, who was unhurt, gave St. Clair a strong squeeze of the hand. "You'll be up and with us again soon, Arthur," he said consolingly, and then he rode away to Ashby. "You may tell General Jackson that we can hold them back," said the cavalry leader grimly. "You have just seen for yourself." "I have, sir," replied Harry, and he galloped away from the rear. But he soon met the general himself, drawn by the uncommonly heavy firing. Harry told him what had happened, but the expression of Jackson's face did not change. "A rather severe encounter," he said, "but Ashby can hold them." All that day, and nearly all that night, and all the following day, Harry passed between Jackson and Ashby, or with them. It was well for the Virginians that they were practically born on horseback, and were trained to open air and the forests. For 36 hours the cavalry were in the saddle, almost without a break. And so was Harry. He had forgotten all about food and rest. He was in a strange, excited mood. He seemed to see everything through a red mist. In all the 36 hours the crash of rifles or the thud of cannon ceased scarcely for a moment. It went on just the same, in day or in night. The Northern troops, although led by no such general as Stonewall Jackson, showed the splendid stuff of which they were made. They were always eager to push hard and yet harder. The Southern troops burnt the bridges over the creeks as they retreated, but the Northern men waded through the water and followed. The clouds of cavalry were always in touch. A skirmish was invariably proceeding at some point. Towards evening of the second day's pursuit they came to Mount Jackson, to which they had retreated once before, and there went into camp in a strong place. But the privates themselves knew that they could not stay there long. They might turn and beat off Fremont's army, but then they would have to reckon with the second army under Shields and the yet heavier masses that McDowell was bringing up. But Jackson himself gave no sign of discouragement. He went cheerfully among the men, and saw that attention, as far as possible at such a time, was given to their needs. Harry hunted up St. Clair and found him with a bandaged shoulder, sitting in his wagon. He was sore but cheerful. "The doctor tells me, Harry, that I can take my place in the line in 3 more days," he said, "but I intend to make it 2. I fancy that we need all the men we can get now, and that I won't be driven back to this wagon." "If I were as well fixed as you are, Arthur," said Langdon, who appeared at this moment on the other side of the wagon, "I'd stay where I was. But it's so long since I've been hauled that I'm afraid the luxury would overpower me. Think of lying on your back and letting the world float peacefully by. Did I say think of it? I was wrong. It is unthinkable. Now, Harry, what plans has old Jack got for us?" "I don't know." "Well, he'll get us out of this. We're sure of that. But when? That's the question." The question remained without an answer. Early the next morning they were on the march again under lowering skies. The heavens from horizon to horizon were a sodden gray and began to drip rain. Harry was sent again to the rear guard, where Ashby's cavalry hung like a curtain, backed by the Invincibles and 1 or 2 other skeleton regiments. Harry joined Sherburne, and now the drip of the rain became a steady beat. Chilling winds from the mountains swept over them. He had preserved through thick and thin, through battle and through march, that big cavalry cloak, and now he buttoned it tightly around him. He saw down the road puffs of smoke and heard the lashing fire of rifles, but it did not make his pulses beat any faster now. He had grown so used to it that it seemed to be his normal life. A bullet, fired from a rifle of longer range than the others, plumped into the mud at the feet of his horse, but he paid no attention to it. He joined Sherburne, who was using his glasses, watching through the heavy, thick air the Northern advance. The brilliant young cavalryman, while as bold and enduring as ever, had changed greatly in the last 2 or 3 weeks. The fine uniform was stained and bedraggled. Sherburne himself had lost more than 20 pounds, and his face was lined and anxious, far more than the face of a mere boy of 23 should have been. "I think they'll press harder than ever," said Sherburne. "Why?" "The Shenandoah River, or rather the North Fork of it, isn't far ahead. They'd like to coop us up against it and make us fight, while their army under Shields and all their other armies, God knows how many they have, are coming up." "The river is bridged, isn't it?" "Yes, but it takes a good while to get an army such as ours, loaded down with prisoners and spoil, across it. And if they rushed us just when we were starting over it, we'd have to turn and give battle. Jupiter, how it rains! Behold the beauties of war, Harry." The wind suddenly veered a little, and with it the rain came hard and fast. It seemed to blow off the mountains in sheets, and for a moment or two Harry was blinded. The beat of the storm upon leaves and earth was so hard that the cracking of the rifles was dulled and deadened. Nevertheless, the rifle fire went on, and as well as Harry could judge, without any decrease in violence. "Hear the bugles now," said Sherburne. "Their scouts are warning them of the approach to the Shenandoah. They'll be coming up in a minute or two in heavier force. Ah, see, Ashby understands too. He's massing the men to hold them back." The rain still poured with all the violence of a deluge, but the Northern force, horse and cannon, pushed forward through the mud and opened with all their might. Ashby's cavalry and the infantry in support replied. There was something grim and awful to Harry in this fight in the raging storm. Now and then he could not see the flame of the firing for the rain in his eyes. By a singular chance, a bullet cut the button of his cloak at the throat, and the cloak flew open there. In a minute he was soaked through and through with water, but he did not notice it. The cavalry, the Invincibles, and the other regiments were making a desperate stand in order that the army might cross the bridge of the Shenandoah. Harry was seized with a sort of fury. Why should these men try to keep them from getting across? It was their right to escape. Presently he found himself firing with his pistols into the great pillar of fire and smoke and rain in front of him. Mud splashed up by the horses struck him in the face now and then, and stung like gunpowder. But he began to shout with joy when he saw that Ashby was holding back the Northern vanguard. Ahead of him, the Southern army was already rumbling over the bridge, while the swollen and unfordable waters of the Shenandoah raced beneath it. But the Northern brigades pressed hard, and Harry did not know whether the rain helped them or hurt them, but at any rate it was terribly uncomfortable. It poured on them in sheets and sheets, and the earth seemed to be a huge quagmire. He wondered how the men were able to keep their ammunition dry enough to fire, but that they did was evident from the crash that went on without ceasing. "In thinking of war before I really knew it," said Harry, "I never thought much of weather." "Does sound commonplace, but it cuts a mighty big figure, I can tell you. If it hadn't rained so hard just before Waterloo, Napoleon would have got up his big guns more easily, winning the battle, and perhaps changing the history of the world. Confound it, look at that crowd pushing forward through the field to take us in the flank." "Western men, I think," said Harry. "Here are two of our field guns. Sherburne, get him to throw some grape in there." It was lucky that the guns approached at that moment. Their commander, as quick of eye as either Harry or Sherburne, unlimbered and swept back the Western men who were seeking to turn their flank. Then Sherburne, with a charge of his cavalry, sent them back further. But at the call of Ashby's trumpet, they turned quickly and galloped after Jackson's army, the main part of which had now passed the bridge. "I suppose we'll burn the bridge after we cross it," said Harry. "Of course, but how on earth can we set fire to it with this Noah's flood coming down?" "I don't know, but they'll manage it somehow. Look, Harry, see the flames bursting from the timbers now. Gallop, men, gallop! We may get our faces scorched in crossing the bridge, but when we're on the other side, it won't be there for the Yankees." The Invincibles and the other infantry regiments all were advancing at the double quick, with the cavalry closing up the rear. Behind them many bugles rang, and through the dense rain they saw the Northern cavalry leaders swinging their sabers and cheering on their men, and they also saw behind them the heavy masses of infantry coming up. Harry knew that it was touch and go. The bulk of the army was across, and if necessary they must sacrifice Ashby's cavalry, but that sacrifice would be too great. Harry had never seen Ashby and his gallant captains show more courage. They fought off the enemy to the very last, and then galloped for the bridge, under a shower of shell and grape and bullets. Ashby's own horse was killed under him, falling headlong in the mud, but in an instant somebody supplied him with a fresh one, upon which he leaped. And then they thundered over the burning bridge, Ashby and Sherburne, the last two to begin the crossing. Harry, who was just ahead of Ashby and Sherburne, felt as if the flames were licking at them. With an involuntary motion, he threw up his hands to protect his eyes from the heat, and he also had a horrible sensation lest the bridge, its supporting timbers burned through, should fall, sending them all into the rushing flood. But the bridge yet held, and Harry uttered a gasp of relief as the feet of his horse struck the deep mud on the other side. They galloped on for 200 or 300 yards, and then, at the command of Ashby, turned. The bridge was a majestic sight, a roaring pyramid that shot forth clouds of smoke and sparks in myriads. "How under the sun did we cross it?" Harry exclaimed. "We crossed it, that's sure, because we're here," said Sherborne. "I confess myself that I don't know just how we did it, Harry, but it's quite certain that the enemy will never cross it. The fire's too strong. Besides, they'd have our men to face." Harry looked about and saw several thousand men drawn up to dispute the passage. But the Northern troops, recognizing its impossibility at that time, made no attempt. Nevertheless, their cannon sent shells curving over the stream, and the Southern cannon sent curving shells in reply. But the burning bridge roared louder, and the pyramid of flame rose higher. The rain, which had never ceased to pour in a deluge, merely seemed to feed it. "Ah, she's about to go now!" exclaimed Sherborne. The bridge seemed to Harry to rear up before his eyes like a living thing, and then draw together a mass of burning timbers. The next moment the whole went with a mighty crash into the river, and the blazing fragments floated swiftly away on the flood. The deep and rapid Shenandoah flowed a barrier between the armies of Jackson and Fremont. "A river can be very beautiful without a bridge, Harry, can't it?" said a voice beside him. It was St. Clair, a heavy bandage over his left shoulder, but a smoking rifle in his right hand nevertheless. "I couldn't stand it any longer, Harry," he said. "I had to get up and join the Invincibles, and you see I'm all right." Harry was compelled to laugh at the sodden figure from which the rain ran in streams, but he admired St. Clair's spirit. "It was by a hair's breadth, Arthur," he said, "but we won across just the same, and now I'm going back to that wagon to finish my cure. I fancy that we'll now have a rest of 6 or 8 hours, if General Jackson doesn't think so much time taken from a war a mere frivolity." The Southern army drew off slowly, but as soon as it was out of sight, the tenacious Northern troops undertook to follow. They attempted to build a bridge of boats, but the flood was so heavy that they were swept away. Then Fremont set men to work to rebuild the bridge, which they could do in 24 hours. But Jackson, meanwhile, was using every one of those precious hours. End of chapter 13, part 2.
Chapter 14, Part 1 of The Scouts of Stonewall. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michael Packard of Western Colorado. The Scouts of Stonewall by Joseph A. Altsheler. Chapter 14, The Double Battle. Part 1. The 24 hours were a rest merely by comparison. There was no pursuit, at least the enemy was not in sight, but the scouts brought word that the bridge over the Shenandoah would be completed in a day and night, and that Fremont would follow. Jackson's army triumphantly passed the last defile of the Massanuttons, and the army of Shields did not appear issuing from it. It was no longer possible for them to be stuck in front and on the flank at the same time, and the army breathed a mighty sigh of relief. At night of the next day, Harry was sitting by the camp of the Invincibles, having received a brief leave of absence from the staff, and he detailed the news to his eager friends. "General Jackson is stripping again for battle," he said to Colonel Leonidas Talbot and Lieutenant Colonel Hector St. Hilaire. "He sent all the sick and wounded across the ferry to Staunton, and he's dispatched his prisoners and captured stores by another road, so he has nothing left but men fit for battle, which includes me," said St. Clair proudly, showing his left shoulder from which the bandage had been taken. "I'm as well as ever." "Men get well fast with Stonewall Jackson," said Colonel Talbot. "I'll confess to you, lads, that I thought it was all up to us there in the lower valley, when we were surrounded by the masses of the enemy, and I don't see yet how we got here." "But we are here, Leonidas," said Lieutenant Colonel Hector St. Hilaire. "That's enough for us to know." "Right, Hector, old friend. It's enough for us to know. Do you by chance happen to have left 2 of those delightful cigarettes?" "Just 2, Leonidas. 1 for you and 1 for me. And now is a chance to smoke 'em." The young lieutenants drew to one side while the 2 old friends smoked and compared notes. They did not smoke, but they compared notes also, and they rested on the turf. The rain had ceased and the grass was dry. They saw through the twilight the dark mass of the Massanuttons, the extreme southern end, and Happy Tom Langdon waved his hand toward the mountain like one who salutes a friend. "Good morning, mountain," he said. "You've been a buffer between us and the enemy more than once, and it took a mind like Stonewall Jackson's to keep moving around you so you would stand between the armies of the enemy and make the Yankees fight, only one army at a time." "You're right," said Harry, who was enjoying the deep luxury of rest. "I didn't know before that mountains could be put to such good use. Look, you can see lights on the ridge now." They saw lights. Evidently those of powerful lanterns swung to and fro, but they did not understand them, nor did they care much. "Signals are just trifles to me now," said Happy Tom. "What do I care for lights moving on a mountain 4 or 5 miles away, when for a month night and day without stopping 1,000,000 Yankees have been shooting rifle bullets at me, and 1,000 of the biggest guns ever cast have been pouring round shot, long shot, shell, grape, canister, and 100 other kinds of missiles that I can't name upon this innocent and unoffending head of mine." "They'll be on us tomorrow, Happy," said St. Clair more gravely. "This picnic of ours can't last more than a day." "I think so, too," said Harry. "So long, boys. I've got to join Captain Shelburne. The General has detached me for service with him under Ashby, and you know that when you are with them, something's going to happen." Harry slept well that night, partly in a camp and partly in a saddle, and he found himself the next day with Ashby and Sherburne near the little town called Harrisonburg. They were on a long hill in thick forest, and the scouts reported that the enemy was coming. The northern armies were uniting now, and they were coming up the valley, expecting to crush all opposition. "Take your glasses, Harry," said Shelburne, "and you'll see a strong force crossing the fields, but it's not strong enough. We've a splendid position here in the forest, and you just watch. Here come your friends, the Invincibles. See, Ashby is forming them in the center, while we of the horse take the flanks." The men in blue, catching the sight of the Confederate uniforms in the wood, charged with a shout, but they did not know the strength of the force before them. The Invincibles poured in a deadly fire at close range, and then Ashby's cavalry, with a yell, charged on either flank. The northern troops, taken by surprise, gave way, and the southern force followed them, firing continuously. They came within 1/2 mile of Harrisonburg, and the main northern army of Fremont was at hand. The general, who had pursued so long, saw his men retreating, and, filled with chagrin and anger, he hurried forward heavier forces of both cavalry and infantry. Other troops came to the relief of Ashby also, and Harry saw what he thought would only be a heavy skirmish grow into a hot battle of size. Fremont, resolved that the North should win a battle in the open field, and rejoiced that he had at last brought his enemy to bay, never ceased to hurry his troops to the combat. Formidable lines of the Western riflemen rushed on either flank, and before their deadly rifles, Ashby's cavalry wavered. Harry saw with consternation that they were about to give way, but Ashby galloped up to the unbroken lines of infantry and ordered them to charge. The words were scarcely out of his mouth when his horse, shot through, fell to the ground. Ashby fell with him, but he sprang instantly to his feet and shouted in a loud voice, "Charge, men! For God's sake, charge! Charge!" With a rush and roar, the Invincibles and their comrades swept forward, but at the same instant Harry saw Ashby fall again. With a cry of horror, he leapt from his horse and ran to him, lifting him in his arms, but he quickly laid him back on the grass. Ashby had been shot through the heart and killed instantly. Harry gazed around him, struck with grief and dismay, but he saw only the resistless rush of the infantry. The Invincibles and their comrades were avenging the death of Turner Ashby. Tired of retreating and hot for action, they struck the Northern Division with a mighty impact, shattering it and driving it back rapidly. The Southern cavalry, recovering also, struck it on the flank, and the defeat was complete. Fremont's wish was denied him. After so much hard marching and such a gallant and tenacious pursuit, he had gone the way of the other Northern generals who opposed Jackson, and was beaten. Although they had driven back the vanguard, winning a smart little victory, and telling to Fremont and Shields that the pursuit of Jackson had now become dangerous, there was gloom in the Southern army. The horsemen did not know until they trotted back and saw Harry kneeling beside his dead body that the great Ashby was gone. For a while they could not believe it. Their brilliant and daring leader, who had led Jackson's vanguard to victory, and who had hung like a covering curtain in retreat, could not have fallen. It seemed impossible that the man who had led for days and days through continuous showers of bullets could have been slain at last by some stray shot. But they lifted him up finally and carried him away to a house in the little neighboring village of Port Republic, Sherburne and the other captains, hot from battle, riding with uncovered heads. He was put upon a bed there, and Harry, a staff officer, was selected to ride to Jackson with the news. He would gladly have evaded the errand, but it was obvious that he was the right messenger. He rode slowly and found Jackson coming up with the main force. Dr. McGuire, his physician, and Colonel Crutchfield, his chief of artillery, riding on either side of him. The general gave one glance at Harry's drooping figure. "Well," he said, "have we not won the victory? From a hilltop our glasses showed the enemy in flight." "Yes, General," said Harry, taking off his hat. "We defeated the enemy, but General Ashby is dead." Jackson and his staff were silent for a moment, and Harry saw the general shrink as if he had received a heavy blow. "Ashby killed! Impossible!" he exclaimed. "It's true, sir. I helped carry his body to a house in Port Republic." "Lead us to that house, Mr. Kenton," said Jackson. Harry rode forward in silence, and the others followed in the same silence. At the house, after they had looked upon the body, Jackson asked to be left alone a while with all that was left of Turner Ashby. The others withdrew, and Harry had always believed that Jackson prayed within that room for the soul of his departed comrade. When he came forth his face had resumed its sternness, but was without other expression, as usual. "He will not show grief now," said Sherburne, "but I think his soul is weeping." "And a bad time for Fremont and Shields is coming," said Harry. "It's a risk that we all take in war," said Dalton, who was more of a fatalist than any of the others. The chief wrote a glowing official tribute to Ashby, saying that his daring was proverbial, his powers of endurance almost incredible, his character heroic, and his sagacity almost intuitive in divining the purposes and movements of the enemy. Yet deeply as Harry had been affected by Ashby's death, it could not remain in his mind long, because they had passed the Massanuttons now, and Fremont and Shields following up the valley must soon unite. Harry believed that Jackson intended to strike a blow. The situation of the Confederacy was again critical. It seemed to Harry that it was always critical, and somebody must wield the sword quick and strong. McClellan, with his great and well-trained army, was before Richmond. It was only the rapid marches and lightning strokes of Jackson that had kept McDowell with another great army from joining him. But to keep back this force of McDowell until they dealt with McClellan, there must yet be other rapid marches and lightning strokes. Harry's sleep that night was the longest in 2 weeks, but he was up at dawn, and he was directed by Jackson to ride forward with Sherburne toward the southern base of the Massanuttons, observe the approach of both Fremont and Shields, and report to him. Harry was glad of this errand. He always liked to ride with Sherburne, who was a fount of cheerfulness, and he was still keyed up to that extraordinary intensity and pitch of excitement that made all things possible. He now understood how the young soldiers of Napoleon in Italy had been able to accomplish so much. It was the man, a leader of inspiration and genius, supercharging them all with electrical fire. Sherburne's troop was a portion of a strong cavalry force, which divided as it reached the base of the Massanuttons, a half passing on either side. Sherburne and Harry rode to the right in order to see the army of Shields. The day was beautiful, with a glorious June sun and gentle winds. But Harry, feeling something strange about it, realized presently that it was the silence. For more than 2 weeks cannon had been thundering and rifles crashing in the valley, almost without cessation. Neither night nor storm had caused any interruption. It seemed strange, almost incredible now, but they heard birds singing as they flew from tree to tree, and peaceful rabbits popped up in the brush. Yet before they went much further, they saw the dark masses of the Northern Army under Shields moving slowly up the valley, and anxious for the junction with Fremont. But the Northern generals were again at a loss. Jackson had turned suddenly and defeated Fremont's vanguard with heavy loss. But what had become of him afterward? Fremont and Shields were uncertain of the position of each other, and they felt still more uncertain about Jackson's. He might fall suddenly upon either, and they grew very cautious as they drew near to the end of the Massanuttons. Sherburne and Harry, after examining the Northern Army through their glasses, rode back with a dozen men to the south base of the Massanuttons. Most of them were signal officers, and Harry and Sherburne, dismounting, climbed the foot of the mountain with them. When they stood upon the crest, and looked to right and left in the clear June air, they beheld a wonderful sight. To the south along Mill Creek lay Jackson's army. To the west, massed in the wider valley, was the army of Fremont, which had followed them so tenaciously, and to the east, but just separated from it by the base of the Massanuttons, were the masses of Shields advancing slowly. Harry, with his powerful glasses, could see the horsemen in front scouting carefully in advance of either army, and once more he appreciated to the full Jackson's skill in utilizing the mountains and rivers to keep his enemies apart. But what would he do now that they were passing the Massanuttons, and there was no longer anything to separate Shields and Fremont? He dismissed the thought. There was an intellect under the old slouch hat of the man who rode Little Sorrel that could rescue them from anything. "Quite a spectacle," said Sherburne. "A man can't often sit at ease on a mountain top and look at 3 armies. Now, Baron, you are to signal from here to General Jackson every movement of our enemies. But just before either Shields or Fremont reaches the base of the mountains, you are to slip down and join us." "Will do, sir," said Barron, the chief signal officer. "We're not likely to go to sleep up here with armies on 3 sides of us." Sherburne, Harry, and 2 other men, who were not to stay, slowly descended the mountain. Harry enjoyed the breathing space. On the mountainside he was lifted for a while above the fierce passions of war. He saw things from afar, and they were softened by distance. He drew deep breaths of air, crisp and cool on the heights, and Sherburne, who saw the glow on his face, understood. The same glow was on his own face. "It's a grand panorama, Harry," he said, "and we'll take our fill of it for a few moments." They stood on a great projection of rock, and looked once more and for a little while into the valley and its divisions. The 2 northern armies were nearer now, and they were still moving. Harry saw the sun flashing over thousands of bayonets. He almost fancied he could hear the crack of the teamsters' whips as the long lines of wagons in the rear creaked along. They descended rapidly, remounting their horses, and galloped back to Jackson. They buried Ashby that day, all the leading Southern officers following him to his grave, and throughout the afternoon the silence was continued. But the signals on the mountain worked and worked, and the signalman with Jackson replied. No movement of the 2 pursuing armies was unknown to the Southern leader. Harry, with an hour's leave, visited once more his friends of the Invincibles. He had begged a package of fine West Indian cigarettes from Sherburne, and he literally laid them at the feet of the 2 colonels. He found them sitting together on the grass, lean, gray men who seemed to be wholly reduced to bone and muscle. "This is a great gift, Harry. Perhaps greater than you think," said Colonel Leonidas Talbot gravely. "I tried to purchase some from the commissariat, but they had none. It seems that General Stonewall Jackson doesn't consider cigarettes necessary for his troops. Anyhow, the way our Confederate money is going, I fancy a package of cigarettes will soon cost $100. Here, Hector, light up. We divide this box half and half. That's right, isn't it, Harry?" "Certainly, sir." Harry passed on to the junior officers and found St. Clair and Happy Tom lying on the grass. Happy pretended to rouse from sleep when Harry came. "Hello, old omen of war," he said. "What's old Jackson expecting of us now?" "I told you never to ask me such a question as that again. The general isn't what you'd call a garrulous man. How's your shoulder, Arthur?" "About well. The muscles are not torn. It was just loss of blood that troubled me for the time." "I hear," said Langdon, that the two Yankee armies are to join soon. The Massanuttons won't be between them much longer, and then they'll have only one of the forks of the river to cross before they'll fall upon each other's breasts and weep with joy. Harry, it seems to me that we're always coming to a fork in the Shenandoah. How many forks does it have, anyhow? Only 2, but the 2 forks have forks of their own. That's the reason we're always coming to deep water. And by the same token, the Yankees are always coming to it too, which is a good thing for us, as we get there first when the bridges are there, and when the Yankees come, they are gone. Not one of these boys understood the feeling of the Northern armies. Late the day before, a messenger from Shields had got through the Massanuttons to Fremont, and had informed him that an easy triumph was at hand. Jackson and his army, he said, fearing the onset of overwhelming numbers, was retreating in great disorder. The two generals were now convinced of speedy victory. They had communicated at last, and they could have some concert of movement. Jackson was less than 30 miles away, and his army was now but a confused mass of stragglers which would dissolve under slight impact. Both had defeats and disappointments to avenge, and they pushed forward now with increasing speed, Shields in particular showing the greatest energy in pursuit. But the roads were still deep in mud, and his army was forced to toil on that all day and the next, while the signalman on the top of the Massanuttons told every movement he made to Stonewall Jackson. The signals the second evening told Jackson that the two Northern armies were advancing fast, and that he would soon have before him an enemy outnumbering him anywhere from 2 to 3 to 1. He had been talking with Ewell just before the definite news was brought, and Harry, Dalton, and the other officers of the staff stood near as their duty bade them. Harry knew the nature of the information, as it was not a secret from any member of the staff, and now they all stood silently on one side and watched Jackson. Even Ewell offered no suggestion, but kept his eyes fixed anxiously on his chief. Harry felt that another one of those critical moments, perhaps the most dangerous of all, had arrived. They had fought army after army in detail, but now they must fight armies united or fly. He did not know that the silent general was preparing the most daring and brilliant of all of his movements in the valley. In the face of both Shields and Fremont, his courage flamed to the highest, and the brain under the old slouch hat grew more powerful and penetrating than ever, and flight never for a moment entered into his scheme. Jackson at length said a few words to Ewell, who sprang upon his horse and rode away to his division. Then, early in the morning, Jackson led the rest of the army into a strange district, the grottos of the Shenandoah. It was a dark region filled beneath with great caves and covered thickly with heavy forest, through the leaves of which the troops caught views of the Massanuttons to the north and the great masses of the Blue Ridge to the east, while far to the west lay other mountains, range on range, but all around them the country was wooded heavily. The army did not make a great amount of noise when it camped in the forest over the caves, and the fires were few. Perhaps some of the men were daunted by the dangers which still surrounded them so thickly after so many days of such fierce fighting. At any rate, they were silent. The Acadians had played no music for a day now, and the band lay upon the ground sunk in deep slumber. Harry had not been sent on any errand, and he was sitting on a stone finishing his supper when Dalton, who had been away with a message, returned. "What's happened, George?" asked Harry. "Nothing yet, but a lot will happen soon." "Where you been?" "I've been on the other side of the Shenandoah. You needn't open your eyes. It's so. Moreover, Ewell's whole division is over there, and it will meet the vanguard of Fremont as he advances. I think I begin to see the general's scheme." "I do too. Ewell will fight off Fremont, holding them there until Jackson can annihilate Shields. Then he will retreat over the river to Jackson, burning the bridge behind him." Dalton nodded. "It looks that way to a man up a tree," he said. "It's like the general," said Harry. "He could bring his whole army on his side, burn the bridge, and in full force attack Shields. But he prefers to defeat them both." "Yes, but I wish to heaven we had more men." "Shh! Here comes the general," said Harry. The two were silent as General Jackson and an officer passed. The general spoke a word or two to the boys and went on. They were but ordinary words, but both felt uplifted because he had spoken to them. End of Chapter 14, Part 1. Recording by Michael Packard of Western Colorado. Chapter 14, Part 2 of The Scouts of Stonewall. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Michael Packard of Western Colorado. The Scouts of Stonewall by Joseph A. Altsheler. Chapter 14. The Double Battle. Part 2. Morning found them motionless in the forest, over the caves. They ate a hasty breakfast and waited. But the scouts were all out, and presently Harry and Dalton were sent toward the Shenandoah. Finding nothing there, they crossed over the bridge and came to Ewell's division, where they had plenty of acquaintances. The sun was now high, and while they were talking with their friends, they heard the faint report of rifle shots far in their front. Presently the scouts came running back and said that the enemy was only 2 miles away and was advancing to the attack. Ewell took off his hat, and his bald head glistened in the sun's rays. But like Jackson, he was always cool, and he calmly moved his troops into position along a low ridge, with heavy woods on either flank. Harry knew this ground, alas, too well. It was among the trees just behind the ridge that Turner Ashby had been slain. Ewell had before him Fremont with 2 to 1, and the rest of the army under Jackson's immediate command was 4 miles away facing Shields. "Do you hear anything behind you, Harry?" asked Dalton. "No, why do you ask?" "If we heard the booming of guns, we'd hear 'em at 4 miles. We'd know that General Jackson himself was engaged. But as there's no sound, Shields hasn't come up, and we'll wait here a while to see if we can't have something important to report." "I don't think so," said Harry. "We know that the enemy is about to attack here in full force, and that's enough to know about this side of the river. We ought to gallop back to General Jackson and tell him." "You're right, Harry," said the Virginian, in whom the sense of duty was strong. "The general may be attacked by the time we get there, and he'll want to know exactly how things are." They galloped back as fast as they could, and found that General Jackson had moved his headquarters to the little village of Port Republic. They found him, and told him the news as he was mounting his horse. But at the same time, an excited and breathless messenger came galloping up from another direction. The vanguard of Shields had already routed his pickets, and the Second Northern Army was pressing forward in full force. As he spoke, the Northern cavalry came in sight, and if those Northern horsemen had known what a prize was almost within their hands, they would have spared no exertion. Make for the bridge, General!" cried Dalton. The horsemen in blue were not coming fast. They rode cautiously through the streets. Southern villages were not friendly to them, and this caution saved Stonewall Jackson. He was on his horse in an instant, galloping for the bridge, and Harry and Dalton were hot behind him. They thundered over the bridge with the Northern cavalry just at their heels, and escaped by a hair's breadth. But the chief of artillery and Dr. McGuire and one of the captains, Willis, were captured, and the rest of the staff was dispersed. "My God!" exclaimed Harry, when the Northern cavalry stopped at the bridge. "What an escape!" He was thinking of Jackson's escape, not his own. And while he was wondering what the general would do, he saw him ride to the bank of the river and watch the Northern cavalry on the other side. Then Harry and Dalton uttered a shout as they saw a Southern battery push forward from the village and open on the cavalry. An infantry regiment, which had been forming in the town, also came up at full speed, uttering the long, high-pitched rebel yell. The Northern vanguard, which had come so near to such a high achievement, was driven back with a rush, and a Southern battery appearing on its flank swept it with shell as it retreated. So heavy was the Southern attack that the infantry also were driven back and their guns taken. The entire vanguard was routed, and as it received no support, even Harry and Dalton knew that the main army under Shields had not yet come up. "That was the closest shave I ever saw," said Dalton. "So it was," said Harry. "But just listen to that noise behind you." A tremendous roar and crash told them that the battle between Ewell and Fremont had opened. Jackson beckoned to Harry, Dalton, and the members of his staff who were reassembled. The 3 who were captured subsequently escaped in the confusion and turmoil and rejoined their general. Setting a powerful force to guard the bridge, Jackson said to his staff, "While we are waiting for Shields to come up with his army, we'll ride over and see how the affair between Ewell and Fremont is coming on." The roar and crash told them that it was coming on with great violence. But Fremont, so strong in pursuit, was not so strong in action. Now that he was face to face with the enemy, he did not attack with all his might. He hesitated, not from personal fear, but from fear on account of his army. The whole force of Jackson might be in front of him, and the apprehensions that he did not feel in pursuit assailed him when he looked at the ridge covered with the enemy. Harry and Dalton watched with breathless interest. A portion of Fremont's army, but not all of it, just when it was needed most, was sent to the charge. Led by the pickets and the skirmishers, they came forward gallantly, a long line of glittering bayonets. In the thick woods on their flank lay 3 Southern regiments, ambushed and not yet stirring. No sunlight penetrated there to show their danger to the soldiers who were breasting the slope. Harry foresaw all, and he drew a long breath for brave men who were marching to a certain fate. "Why don't they look? Why don't they look?" he found himself exclaiming. The next instant the entire wood burst into flame. Picking their aim and firing at short range, the Southern riflemen sent sheet after sheet of bullets into the charging ranks. It was more than human blood and flesh could stand, and the Northern regiments gave way. But it was not a rout. They retreated on their reserves and stood there recovering themselves, while Southern riflemen reloaded, but did not pursue. The regiments which had done the deadly work sank back into the woods, and seemingly the battle was over. Harry had not been under fire. He and Dalton, the rest of Jackson's staff, and the general himself merely watched, nor did Jackson give any further orders to his able Lieutenant Ewell. He allowed him to make the battle his own, and in Harry's opinion, he was making it right. There came a silence that seemed interminably long to Harry. The sunlight blazed down, and the 2 armies stood looking at each other across a field that was strewn with the fallen. It would have been folly for the men in blue to charge again, and it was the chief business of the Southern troops to hold them back. Therefore they stood in their positions and watched. Harry judged that the bulk of Fremont's army was not yet up. It was this failure to bring superior numbers to bear at the right time that was always the ruin of the Northern generals in the valley, because the genius on the other side invariably saw the mistake and profited by it. Harry and Dalton still waited, wondering. Jackson himself sat quietly on his horse and issued no order. The Northern troops were motionless, and Harry, who knew how precious time was, with the rest of Fremont's army coming up, wondered again. But Trimble, the commander of the Southern riflemen, hidden in the wood, saw a chance. He would send his men under the cover of the forest and hurl them suddenly upon the northern flank. Ewell gave his consent and said that he would charge too if the movement was successful. Harry, watching, saw the Southern regiments in the wood steal from the forest, pass swiftly up the ravine, and then, delivering a shattering fire at short range, charge with bayonet upon the northern flank. The men in blue, surprised by so fierce an onset, gave way. Uttering the rebel yell, the Southerners followed and pushed them further and further. Ewell's quick eye, noting the success, sent forward his own center in a heavy charge. Fremont, from the rear, hurried forward new troops, but they were beaten as fast as they arrived. The batteries were compelled to unlimber and take to flight. The fresh brigade dispatched by Fremont was routed, and the whole Southern line pressed forward, driving the Northern army before it. "General Jackson was wise in trusting General Ewell," said Dalton to Harry. "He's won a notable victory. I wonder how far he'll push it." "Not far, I think. All Ewell's got to do is hold Fremont, and he has surely held him. There's Shield on the other side of the river with whom we have to deal. But you know, George, that all the time we've been sitting here watching this battle in front of us, I've been afraid we'd hear the booming of the guns from the other side of the river telling that Shields was up. We scorched their faces so badly here at Cross Keys that they must be hesitating. Lord, Harry, how old Stonewall plays with fire. To attack and defeat one army, and then with the other only a few miles away, must take nerves all of steel." But if Ewell keeps on following Fremont, he'll be too far away when we turn to deal with Shields. But he won't go too far. There are the trumpets now recalling the army. The mellow notes were calling in eager riflemen who wished to continue the pursuit. But the army was not to retire. It held the battlefield, and now that the twilight was coming, the men began to build their fires, which blazed through the night within sight of those of the enemy. The sentinels of the two armies were within speaking distance of one another, and often in the dark, as happened after many other battle in this war, Yank and Reb passed a friendly word or two. They met, too, on the field, where they carried away their dead and wounded. But on such errands there was always peace. Those hours of the night were precious, but Fremont did not use them. Defeated, he held back, magnifying the numbers of his enemy, fearing that Jackson was in front of him with his whole army, and once more out of touch with his allies' Shields. But Stonewall Jackson was all activity. The great warlike intellect was working with the utmost precision and speed. Having beaten back Fremont, he was making ready for Shields. The first part of the drama, as he had planned it, had been carried through with brilliant success, and he meant that the next should be its equal. Harry was not off his horse that night. He carried message after message to generals and colonels and captains. He saw the main portion of Ewell's army withdrawn from Fremont's front, leaving only a single brigade to hold him, in case he should advance at dawn. But he saw the fires increased, and he carried orders that the men should build them high, and see that they did not go down. When he came back from one of these errands about midnight, just after the rise of the moon, he found General Jackson standing upon the bank of the river, giving minute directions to a swarm of officers. His mind missed nothing. He directed not only the movement of the troops, but he saw also that the trains of ammunition and food were sent to the proper points. About halfway between midnight and morning he laid down and slept in a small house near the river bank. Shortly before dawn, the commanders of a battery, looking for one of its officers, entered the house and saw Jackson, dressed for the saddle, sword, boots, spurs, and all, laying on his face upon the bed asleep. On a small table near him stood a short piece of tallow candle, sputtering dimly. But the officer saw that it was Jackson, and he turned on tiptoe to withdraw. The general awoke instantly, sat up and demanded who was there. When the officer explained, he said he was glad that he had been awakened, asked about the disposition of the troops, and gave further commands. He did not go to sleep again. But Harry's orders carried him far beyond midnight, and he had no thought of sleep. Once more, repressed but intense excitement had complete hold of him. He could not have slept had the chance been given to him. The bulk of the army was now in front of Shields, and the pickets were not only in touch, but were skirmishing actively. All through the late hours after midnight, Harry heard the flash of their firing in front of him. The cavalry, under Sherburne and other daring leaders, were exchanging shots with the equally daring cavalry of the enemy. As the dawn approached, the firing was heavier. Harry knew that the day would witness a great battle, and his heart was filled with anxiety. The army, led by Shields, showed signs of greater energy and tenacity than that led by Fremont. The northern troops that had fought so fiercely at Kernstown were there, and they also had leaders who would not be daunted by doubts and numbers. Harry wondered if they had heard of the defeat of Fremont at Cross Keys. He looked at the flashing of the rifles in the dusk, and before dawn rode back to the house where his commander slept. He was ready and waiting when Jackson came forth, and Dalton, appearing from somewhere in the dusk, sat silently on his horse by his side. The general with his staff at once rode toward the front, and the masses of the Southern army also swung forward. Harry saw that, according to Jackson's custom, they would attack, not wait for it. It was yet dusky, but the firing in their front was increasing in intensity. There was a steady crash, and a blaze of light from the rifle muzzles ran through the forest. He took an order to the Acadians to move forward behind the two batteries, and as he came back he passed the Invincibles, now merely a skeleton regiment, but advancing in perfect order, the two colonels on their flanks near the head. He also saw St. Clair and Langdon, but he had time only to wave his hand to them as he galloped back to Jackson. The dusk rapidly grew thinner. Then the burnished sun rose over the hills, and Harry saw the northern army before him, spread across a level between the river and a spur of the Blue Bridge, and also on the slopes and in the woods. A heavy battery crowned one of the hills. Another was posted in the forest, and there were more guns between. Harry saw that the position was strong, and he noted with amazement that the Northern forces did not seem to outnumber Jackson's. It was evident that Shields, with the majority of his force, was not yet up. He glanced at Jackson. He knew that the fact could not have escaped the general, but he saw no trace of exultation on his face. There was another fact that Harry did not then know. Nearly all the men who had fought successfully against Jackson at Kernstown were in that vanguard, and Tyler, who had deemed himself a victor there, commanded them. Everybody else had been beaten by Stonewall Jackson, but not they. Confident of victory, they asked to be led against the Southern army, and they felt only joy when the rising sunlight disclosed their foe. They were the men of Ohio and West Virginia again, staunch and sturdy. Harry knew instinctively that the battle would be fierce, pushed to the utmost. Jackson had no other choice, and as the sunlight spread over the valley, although the mountains were yet in mist, the cannon on the flanks opened with a tremendous discharge, followed by crash after crash, north and south replying to each other. A Southern column also marched along the slope of the hills in order to take Tyler's men in flank. Harry looked eagerly to see the Northern troops give way, but they held fast. The veterans of Ohio and West Virginia refused to give ground, and Winder, who led the Southern column, could make no progress. Harry watched with bated breath and a feeling of alarm. Were they to lose after such splendid plans and such unparalleled exertions? The sun, rising higher, poured down a flood of golden beams, driving the mists from the mountains, and disclosing the plain and slopes below wrapped in fire, shot through with the gleam of steel from the bayonets. Tyler, who commanded the Northern vanguard, proved himself here, as at Kernstown, a brave and worthy foe. He too had eyes to see and a brain to think. Seeing that his Ohio and West Virginia men were standing fast against every attack made by Winder, he hurried fresh troops to their aid, that they might attack in return. The battle thickened fast. At the point of contact along the slopes and in the woods, there was a continued roar of cannon and rifles. Enemies came face to face, and the men of Jackson, victorious on so many fields, were slowly pressed back. A shout of triumph rose from the Union lines, and the eager Tyler brought yet more troops into action. 2 of Ewell's battalions heard the thunder of the battle and rushed of their own accord to the relief of their commander. But they were unable to stem the fury of Ohio and West Virginia, and they were borne back with the others, hearing as it roared in their ears that cry of victory from their foe, which they had so often compelled that foe himself to hear. But it was more bitter to none than to Harry. Sitting on his horse in the rear, he saw in the blazing sunlight everything that passed. He saw for the first time in many days the men in gray yielding. The incredible was happening. After beating Fremont, after all their superb tactics, they were now losing to Shields. He looked at Jackson, hoping to receive some order that would take him into action, but the general said nothing. He was watching the battle, and his face was inscrutable. Harry wondered how he could preserve his calm while his troops were being beaten in front, and the army of Fremont might thunder at any moment on his flank or rear. Truly, the nerves that could remain steady in such moments must be made of steel triply wrought. The Northern army, stronger and more resolute than ever, was coming on, a long blue line crusted with bayonets. The Northern cannon, posted well and served with coolness and precision, swept the Southern ranks. The men in gray retreated faster, and some of their guns were taken. The Union troops charged upon them more fiercely than ever, and the regiments threatened to fall into panic. Then Jackson, shouting to his staff to follow, spurred forward into the mob and begged them to stand. He rode among them, striking some with the flat of his sword, and encouraging others. His officers showed the same energy and courage, but the columns, losing cohesion, seemed on the point of dissolving in the face of an enemy who pressed them so hard. Harry uttered a groan, which nobody heard in all the crash and tumult. His heart sank like lead. Hope was gone, clean away. But at the very moment that hope departed, he heard a great cheer, followed a moment later by a terrific crash of rifles and cannon. Then he saw those blessed Acadians charging in the smoke along the slope. They had come through the woods, and they rushed directly upon the great northern battery posted there. But so well were those guns handled, and so fierce was their fire, that the Acadians were driven back. They returned to the charge, were driven back again, but coming on a third time, took all the battery except one gun. Then, with triumphant shouts, they turned them on their late owners. The whole southern line seemed to recover itself at once. The remainder of Ewell's troops reached the field and enabled their comrades to turn and attack. The Stonewall Brigade in the center, where Jackson was, returned to the charge. In a few minutes, fickle fortune had faced about completely. The Union men saw victory once more snatched from their hands. Their columns in the plain were being raked by powerful batteries on the flank, many of the guns having recently been theirs. They must retreat or be destroyed. The brave and skillful Tyler reluctantly gave the order to retreat. And when Harry saw the blue line go back, he shouted with joy. Then the rebel yell, thrilling, vast, and triumphant, swelled along the whole line, which lifted up itself and rushed at the enemy, the cavalry charging fiercely on the flanks. Shields got up fresh troops, but it was too late. The men in gray were pouring forward, victorious at every point, and sweeping everything before them, while the army of Fremont, arriving at the river at noon, saw burned bridges, the terrible battlefield on the other side strewn with the fallen, and the southern legions thundering northward in pursuit of the Second Army, superior in numbers to their own, that they had defeated in 2 days. Every pulse in Harry beat with excitement. His soul sprang up at once from the depths to the stars. This, when hope seemed wholly gone, was the crowning and culminating victory. The achievement of Jackson equaled anything of which he had ever heard. And while the army of Fremont was held fast on the other side of the river, the Second Army under Shields, beaten in its turn, was retreating at a headlong rate down the valley. The veterans of Kernstown had fought magnificently, but they had been outgeneraled, and, like all the others, had gone down in defeat before Jackson. Jackson, merciless alike in battle and pursuit, pushed hard after the men in blue for 9 or 10 miles down the river, capturing cannon and prisoners. The Ohio and West Virginia men began at last to reform again, and night coming on, Jackson stopped the pursuit. He still could not afford to go too far down the valley, lest the remains of Fremont's army appear in his rear. As they went back in the night, Harry and Dalton talked together in low tones. Jackson was just ahead of them, riding Little Sorrel, silent, his shoulders stooped a little, his mind apparently having passed on from the problems of the day, which were solved, to those of the morrow, which were to be solved. He replied only with a smile to the members of his staff who congratulated him now upon this his extraordinary achievement, surpassing anything that he had done hitherto in the valley. For Harry and Dalton, young hero worshippers, he had assumed a stature yet greater. In their boyish eyes, he was the man who did the impossible over and over again. The great martial brain was still at work. Having won 2 fresh victories in 2 days, and having paralyzed the operations of his enemies, Jackson was preparing for other bewildering movements. Harry and Dalton, and all the other members of the staff, were riding forth presently in the dusk with the orders for the different brigades and regiments to concentrate at Brown's Gap in the mountains, from which point Jackson could march to the attack of McClellan before Richmond, or return to deal blows at his opponents in the valley as he pleased. But whichever he choose, McDowell and 60,000 men would not be present at the fight for Richmond. Jackson, with his little army, had hurled back the Union right, and the two Union armies could not be united in time. The whole Southern army was gathered at midnight in Brown's Gap, and the men who had eaten but little and slept but little in 48 hours, and who had fought 2 fierce and victorious battles in that time, throwing themselves upon the ground, slept like dead men. While they slept, consternation was spreading in the North. Lincoln, ever hopeful and never yielding, had believed that Jackson was in disorderly flight up the valley, and so had his Secretary of War, Stanton. The fact that this fleeing force had turned suddenly and beaten both Fremont and Shields, each of whom had superior forces, was unbelievable, but it was true. But Lincoln and the North recalled their courage and turned hopeful eyes toward McClellan. End of Chapter 14, Part 2. Recording by Michael Packard of Western Colorado.
Chapter 15, Part 1 of The Scouts of Stonewall. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The Scouts of Stonewall by Joseph A. Altsheler. Chapter 15, The 7 Days, Part 1. Harry did not awaken until late the next morning. Jackson, for once, allowed his soldiers a long rest, and they were entitled to it. When he rose from his blankets he found fires burning, and the pleasant odor of coffee, bacon, and other food came to his nostrils. Many wounded were stretched on blankets, but, as usual, they were stoics and made no complaint. The army, in truth, was joyous. Even more, it was exultant. Everyone had the feeling that he had shared in mighty triumphs, unparalleled exploits, but they gave the chief credit to their leader, and they spoke admiringly and affectionately of Old Jack. The whole day was passed in luxury long unknown to them. They had an abundance of food, mostly captured, and their rations were not limited. The Acadian band reappeared and played with as much spirit as ever, and once more the dark, strong men of Louisiana, clasped in one another's arms, danced on the grass. Harry sat with St. Clair, Happy Tom, and Dalton, and watched them. "I was taught that dancing was wicked," said Dalton, "but it doesn't look wicked to me, and I notice that the general doesn't forbid it." "Wicked?" said St. Clair. "Why, after we take Washington, you ought to come down to Charleston and see us dance then. It's good instead of wicked. It's more than that. It's a thing of beauty, a grace, a joy, almost a rite." "All that Arthur says is true," said Happy Tom. "I'm a Sea Islander myself, but we go over to Charleston in the winter. Still, I think you'll have to do without me at those dances, Arthur. I shall probably be kept for some time in the North, acting as proconsul for Pennsylvania or Massachusetts." "Which way do you think we are going from here, Harry?" asked St. Clair. "I don't think it's possible for General Jackson to stay longer than 24 hours in one place, and I know that he always goes to you for instructions before he makes any movement." "That's so. He spoke to me this morning asking what he ought to do, but I told him the troops needed a rest of 1 day, but that he mustn't make it more than 1 day or he'd spoil 'em." Happy Tom, who was lying on the ground, sat up abruptly. "If you ever hear of old Stonewall spoiling anybody or anything," he said, "just you report it to me, and I'll tell you that it's not so." "I believe," said Dalton, "that we're going to leave the valley. Both Shields and Fremont are still retreating. Our cavalry scouts brought in that word this morning. We've heard also that Johnston and McClellan fought a big battle at a place called 7 Pines, and that after it McClellan hung back, waiting for McDowell, whom Old Jack has kept busy. General Johnston was wounded at 7 Pines, and General Robert Edward Lee is now in command of our main army. That's news! It's more! It's history!" exclaimed St. Clair. "I think you're right, Harry. 2-1 that we go to Richmond. And for one, I'll be glad. Then we'll be right in the middle of the biggest doings." "I'm feeling that way, too," said Happy Tom. "But I know one thing." "What's that?" "Not a soul in this army, except Old Jack himself, will know a thing about it until it's done, and maybe we won't know very much then. I passed Old Jack about an hour ago, and he saw me as clearly and plainly as I see you, but he did not tell me a thing about his plans. He did not even say a word. Did not speak. Just cut me dead." Not one of the four was destined for some days to learn what Jackson intended. His highest officers even were kept in the same ignorance. While the bulk of the army did little, the cavalry under Munford, who had succeeded Ashby, were exceedingly active. The horsemen were like a swarm of hornets in front of Jackson, and so great was their activity that the Northern leaders were unable to gauge their numbers. Fremont, exposed to these raids, retreated farther down the valley, leaving 200 of his wounded and many stores in the hands of Munford. Then Jackson crossed South River and marched into extensive woods by the Shenandoah, where his army lay for 5 full days. It was almost incredible to Harry and his friends that they should have so long a rest, but they had it. They luxuriated there among the trees in the beautiful June weather, listening to the music of the Acadians, eating and drinking, and sleeping as men have seldom slept before. But while the infantry was resting, the activity of the cavalry never ceased. These men, riding over the country in which most of them were born, missed no movement of the enemy, and maintained the illusion that their numbers were 4 or 5 times the fact. Harry, trying to fathom Jackson's purpose, gave it up after that comparatively long stay beside the Shenandoah. He did not know that it was part of a complicated plan, that Lee and Jackson, although yet apart, were now beginning their celebrated work together. Near Richmond, Northern prisoners saw long lines of trains moving north and apparently crowded with soldiers. For Jackson, of course, and intended to help him in his great march on Washington. But Jackson hung a complete veil about his own movements. His highest officers told one another in confidence things that they believed to be true, but which were not. It was the general opinion among them that Jackson would soon leave in pursuit of Fremont. The pleasant camp by the Shenandoah was broken up suddenly, and the men began to march, they knew not where. Officers rode among them with stern orders, carried out sternly. In front, and on either flank, rode lines of cavalry who allowed not a soul to pass either in or out. An equally strong line of cavalry in the rear drove in front of it every straggler or camp follower. There was not a single person inside the whole army of Jackson who could get outside it except Jackson himself. An extraordinary ban of ignorance was also placed upon them, and it was enforced to the letter. No soldier should give the name of a village or a farm through which he passed, although the farm might be his father's, or the village might be the one in which he was born. If a man were asked a question, no matter what, he must answer, "I don't know." The young Southern soldiers, indignant at first, enjoyed it as their natural humor rose to the surface. "Young fellow," said Happy Tom to St. Clair, "what's your name?" "I don't know." "Don't know your own name? Why, you must be feeble-minded. Are you?" "I don't know." "Well, you may not know, but you look it. Do you think old Jack is a good general?" "I don't know." "Do you think he's feeble-minded like yourself?" "I don't know." "What? You dare to intimate that Stonewall Jackson, the greatest general the world has ever known, is feeble-minded? You have insulted him, and in his name I challenge you to fight me, sir. Do you accept?" "I don't know." The two looked at each other and grinned. The ignorance of the army grew dense beyond all computation. Long afterward, "I don't know" became a favorite and convenient reply, even when the knowledge was present. It was nearly 2 weeks after Port Republic before the troops had any idea where they were going. They came to a little place called Hanover Junction, and they thought they were going to turn there and meet McDowell, but they passed on, and one evening they encamped in a wood. As they were eating supper they heard the muttering thunder of guns toward the south, and throughout the brigades the conviction spread that they were on the way to Richmond. The next night Harry, who was asleep, was touched by a light hand. He awoke instantly, and when he saw General Jackson standing over him, he sprang up. "I am going on a long ride," said the general briefly, "and I want only one man to go with me. I've chosen you. Get your horse. We start in 5 minutes." Harry, a little dazed yet from sleep and the great honor that had been thrust upon him, ran nevertheless for his horse and was ready with a minute to spare. "Keep by my side," said Jackson curtly, and the two rode in silence from the camp, watched in wonder by the sentinels, who saw their general and his lone attendant disappear in the forest to the south. It was 1 o'clock in the morning of a moonlight night, and the errand of Jackson was an absolute secret. 3 or 4 miles from the camp a sentinel slipped from the woods and stopped them. He was one of their own pickets, on a far outlying post, but to the amazement of Harry, Jackson did not tell who he was. "I'm an officer on Stonewall Jackson's staff, carrying dispatches," he said. "You must let me pass." "It's not enough. Show me an order from him." "I have no order," replied the equable voice, "but my dispatches are of the greatest importance. Kindly let me pass immediately." The sentinel shook his head. "Draw back your horses," he said. "Without an order from the general, you don't go a step further." Harry had not spoken a word. He had ceased to wonder why Jackson refused to reveal his identity. If he did not do so, it must be for some excellent reason, and meanwhile the boy waited placidly. "So you won't let us pass," said Jackson. "Is the commander of the picket nearby?" "I can whistle so he'll hear me." "Then will you kindly whistle?" The sentinel looked again at the quiet man on the horse, put his fingers to his lips and blew loudly. An officer emerged from the woods and said, "What is it, Felton?" Then he glanced at the man on the horse and started violently. "General Jackson!" he exclaimed. The sentinel turned pale, but said nothing. "Yes, I'm General Jackson," said the general, "and I ride with this lieutenant of my staff on an errand. But both of you must swear to me that you have not seen me." Then he turned to the sentinel. "You did right to stop us," he said. "I wish that all our sentinels were as faithful as you." Then, while the man glowed with gratitude, he and Harry rode on. Jackson was in deep thought and did not speak. Harry, a little awed by this strange ride, looked up at the trees and the dusky heavens. He heard the far hoot of an owl, and he shivered a little. What if a troop of Northern cavalry should suddenly burst upon them? But no troop of the Northern horse, no horse of any kind, appeared. Instead, Jackson's own horse began to pant and stumble. Soon he gave out entirely. It was not yet day, but dimly to the right they saw the roof of a house among some trees. It was a poor Virginia farm that did not have horses on it, and Jackson suggested to Harry that they wake up the people and secure 2 fresh mounts. The commander of an army and his young aide walked a little distance down a road, entered a lawn, drove off 2 barking dogs, and knocked loud on the front door of the house with the butts of their riding whips. A head was at last thrust out of an upper window, and a sleepy and indignant voice demanded what they wanted. "We're 2 officers from General Jackson's army riding on important duty," replied the general, in his usual mild tones. "Our horses have broken down and we want to obtain new ones." "What's your names? What's your rank?" demanded the gruff voice. "We cannot give our names." "Then clear out, you're frauds. If I find you hanging about here, I'll shoot at you, and I tell you for your good that I'm no bad shot." The shutter of the window closed with a bang, but the two dogs that had been driven off began to bark again at a safe distance. Harry glanced at his general. "Isn't that a stable among the trees?" asked Jackson. "Yes, sir." "Then we'll find our horses there. Get the other two and bring them here." Harry obeyed promptly and they opened the stable, finding good horses, of which they selected the two best, to which they changed their saddles and bridles. "We'll leave our own horses for our inhospitable friends," said General Jackson, "and he'll not suffer by the exchange." Mounting the fresh horses, they rode rapidly, and, after the coming of the dawn, Harry saw that they were approaching Richmond, and he guessed now what was coming. General Jackson had in his pocket a pass sent to him by General Lee, and they swiftly went through the lines of pickets and then on through Richmond. People were astir in the streets of the Southern capital, and many of them saw the bearded man in an old uniform and a black slouch hat riding by, accompanied by only a boy, but not one of them knew that this was Stonewall Jackson, whose fame had been filling their ears for a month past. Nor, if they had known him, would they have divined how much ill his passage boded to the great army of McClellan. They went through Richmond and on toward the front. Midday passed, and at 3 o'clock they reached the house in which Lee had established his headquarters. "Who is it?" asked a sentinel at the door. "Tell General Lee that General Jackson is waiting." The sentinel hurried inside. General Jackson and his aide dismounted, and a moment later General Lee came out, extending his hand, which Jackson clasped. The two stood a moment looking at each other. It was the first time that they had met in the war, but Harry saw by the glance that passed that each knew the other a man, not an ordinary man, nor even a man of 10,000, but a genius of the kind that appears but seldom. It was all the more extraordinary that the two should appear at the same time, serving together in perfect harmony, and sustaining for so long by their united power and intellect a cause that seemed lost from the first. It was not any wonder that Harry gazed with all his eyes at the memorable meeting. He knew Jackson, and he was already learning much of Lee. He saw in the Confederate commander-in-chief a man past 50, ruddy of countenance, hair and beard short, gray and thick, his figure tall and powerful, and his expression at once penetrating and kind. He was dressed in a fine gray uniform, precise and neat. Such was Robert Edward Lee, and Harry thought him the most impressive human being upon whom he had ever looked. "General Jackson," said General Lee, "this is a fortunate meeting. You have saved the Confederacy." General Jackson made a gesture of dissent, but General Lee took him by the arm and they went into the house. General Jackson turned a moment at the door and motioned to Harry to follow. The boy went in and found himself in a large room. 3 men had risen from cane chairs to meet the visitor. One, broad of shoulders, middle-aged and sturdy, was Longstreet. The others, more slender of figure, were the 2 Hills. The major generals came forward eagerly to meet Jackson, and they also had friendly greetings for his young aide. Lee handed them glasses of milk, which they drank thirstily. "You'll find an aide of mine in the next room," said General Lee to Harry. "He's a little older than you are, but you should get along together." Harry bowed and withdrew, and the aide, Charlie Gordon, gave him a hearty welcome. He was 3 or 4 years Harry's senior, something of a scholar, but frank and open. When they had exchanged names, Gordon said, "Stretch out a bit on this old sofa. You look tired. You've been riding a long distance. How many miles have you come?" "I don't know," replied Harry, as he lay luxuriously on the sofa, "but we started at 1 o'clock this morning, and it is now 3 o'clock in the afternoon." "14 hours. It's like what we've been hearing of Stonewall Jackson. I took a peep at him from the window as you rode up." "I suppose you didn't see much but dust." "They certainly tell extraordinary things of General Jackson. It can't be possible that all are true." It is possible. They're all true, and more. I tell you, Gordon, when you hear anything wonderful about Stonewall Jackson, just you believe it. Don't ask any questions or reasons, but believe it." "I think I shall," said Gordon, convinced. "But don't forget, Kenton, that we've got a mighty man here, too. You can't be with General Lee long without feeling that you're in the presence of genius." "And they're friends, not jealous of each other. You could see that at a glance." "The coming of Jackson is like dawn bursting from the dark. I feel, Kenton, that McClellan's time is at hand." Harry slept a little after a while, but when he awoke the generals were still in council in the great room. "I let you sleep because I saw you needed it," said Gordon with a smile. "But I think they're about through in there now. I hear them moving about." General Jackson presently called Harry and they rode away. The young aide was sent back to the Valley Army with a message for it to advance as fast as possible in order that it might be hurled on McClellan's flank. Others carried the same message lest there be any default of chance. End of chapter 15, part 1. Chapter 15, part 2 of The Scouts of Stonewall. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. This recording is by Mark Smith of Simpsonville, South Carolina. The Scouts of Stonewall by Joseph A. Altsheler. Chapter 15, The 7 Days, Part 2. While the army of Jackson swept down by Richmond to join Lee, it was lost again to the north. At Washington they still believed it in the valley, advancing on Fremont or Shields. Banks and McDowell had the same belief. McClellan was also at a loss. 2 or 3 scouts had brought in reports that it was marching toward Richmond, but he could not believe them. The Secretary of War at Washington telegraphed to McClellan that the Union armies under McDowell, Banks, Fremont, and Shields were to be consolidated in one great army under McDowell, which would crush Jackson utterly in the valley. At the very moment McClellan was reading this telegram, the army of Jackson, far to the south of McDowell, was driving in the pickets on his own flank. Jackson's men had come into a region quite different from the valley. There they marched and fought over firm ground and crossed rivers with hard rocky banks. Now they were in a land of many deep rivers that flowed in a slow yellow flood with vast swamps between. Most of it was heavy with forest and bushes, and the heat was great. At night vast quantities of mosquitoes and flies and other insects fed bounteously upon them. The Invincibles lifted up their voices and wept. "Can't you persuade old Jack to take us back to the valley, Harry?" said Uncle Tom. "If I'm to die, I'd rather be shot by an honest Yankee soldier than to be stung to death by these clouds of bloodsuckers. Oh, for our happy valley, where we shot at our enemy and he shot at us, both standing on firm ground." "You won't be thinking much about mosquitoes and rivers soon," said Harry. "Listen to that, will you? You know the sound, don't you?" "Know it? Well, I ought to know it. It's the booming of cannon, but it doesn't frighten these mosquitoes and flies a particle. A cannonball whistling by my head would scare me half to death, but it wouldn't disturb them a bit. They'd look with an evil eye at that cannonball as it flew by and say to it in threatening tones, 'What are you doing here? Let this fellow alone. He belongs to us.'" "Which way is McClellan coming, Harry?" asked St. Clair. "Off there to the east, where you hear the guns." "How many men has he?" "Anywhere from 100,000 to 130,000. There are various reports." Langdon, who had been listening, whistled. "It doesn't look like a picnic for the Invincibles," he said. "When I volunteered for this war, I didn't volunteer to fight a pitched battle every day. What did you volunteer for, Harry?" "I don't know." The 3 laughed. Jackson's famous order certainly fitted well there. "And you don't know either," said Happy Tom, "what all that thunder off there to the south and east means. It's the big guns, but who are fighting and where?" "There's to be a general attack on McClellan along the line of the Chickahominy River," said Harry, "and our army is to be a part of the attacking force, but my knowledge goes no further." "Then I'm reckoning that some part of our army has attacked already," said Happy Tom. "Maybe they're ahead of time, or maybe the rest are behind time. But there they go! My eyes, how they're whooping it up!" The cannonade was growing in intensity and volume. Despite the sunset, they saw an almost continuous flare of red on the horizon. The three boys felt some awe as they sat there and listened and looked. Well they might. Battle on a far greater scale than anything witnessed before in America had begun already. 200,000 men were about to meet in desperate conflict in the thickets and swamps along the Chickahominy. Richmond had already heard the crash of McClellan's guns more than once, but apprehension was passing away. Lee, whom they had learned so quickly to trust, stood with 90,000 men between them and McClellan, and with him was the redoubtable Jackson and his veterans of the valley with their caps full of victories. McClellan had the larger force, but Lee was on the defensive in his own country, a region which offered great difficulties to the invader. Harry and his comrades wondered why Jackson did not move, but he remained in his place, and when Harry fell asleep, he still heard the thudding of the guns across the vast reach of rivers and creeks, swamps and thickets. When he awoke in the morning they were already at work again, flaring at intervals down there on the eastern horizon. The whole wet, swampy country, so different from his own, seemed to be deserted by everything save the armies. No rabbits sprang up in the thickets, and there were no birds. Everything had fled already in the presence of war. But the army marched. After a brief breakfast the brigades moved down the road, and Harry saw clearly that these veterans of the valley were tremulous with excitement. Youthful, eager, and used to victory, they were anxious to be at the very center of affairs, which were now on a gigantic scale, and the throbbing of the distant guns steadily drew them on. "We'll get all we want before this is through," said Dalton gravely to Harry. "I think so too. Listen to those big guns, George. And I think I can hear the crack of rifles, too. Our pickets and those of the enemy must be in contact in the forest there on our left." "I haven't a doubt of it, but if we rode that way, like as not we'd strike first a swamp or a creek 20 feet deep. I get all tangled up in this kind of a country." "So do I, but it doesn't make any difference. We just stick along with old Jack." The army marched on a long time, always to the accompaniment of that sinister mutter in the southeast. Then they heard the note of a bugle in front of them, and Jackson with his staff rode forward near a little church called Walnut Grove, where Lee and his staff sat on their horses waiting. Harry noticed with pride how all the members of Lee's staff crowded forward to see the renowned Jackson. It was his general upon whom so many were looking, and there was curiosity among Stonewall's men, too, about Lee. As Harry drew back a little while the two generals talked, he found himself again with the officers of the Invincibles. "He has grown gray since we were with him in Mexico, Hector," he heard Colonel Leonidas Talbot say to Lieutenant Colonel Hector St. Hilaire. "Yes, Leonidas, grayer but stronger. What a brow and eye!" St. Clair and Langdon, who had never seen Lee before, were eager. "Is he the right man for old Jack to follow, Harry?" asked Happy Tom. "I don't think there's any doubt of it, Happy. I saw how they agreed the first time they met, and you can see it now. You'll find them working together as smooth as silk. Ah, here we go again." "Then if it's as you say, I suppose it's all up with McClellan, and I needn't trouble my mind about the matter any more. Hereafter I'll just go ahead and obey orders." The words were light, but there was no frivolity in the minds of the three. Despite the many battles through which they had already gone, their hearts were beating hard just then, while that roaring was going on the horizon, and they knew that a great battle was at hand. Lee and his staff rode toward the battle, and then, to the amazement of his men, Jackson led his army into the deep woods away from the sound of the thundering guns which had been calling to them so incessantly. Harry was mystified, and the general vouchsafed no word, even to his own staff. They marched on through woods, across fields, along the edges of swamps, and that crash of battle grew fainter behind them, but never died out. "What do you think it means?" Harry whispered to Dalton. "Don't know. I'm not thinking. I'm not here to think at such times. All the thinking we need is going on under the old slouch hat there. Harry, didn't we go with him all through the valley? Can't we still trust him? I can and will." "Same here." The army curved about again. Harry, wholly unfamiliar with the country, did not notice it until the roar of the battle began to rise again, showing that they were coming nearer. Then he divined the plan. Jackson was making this circuit through the woods to fall on the northern flank. It was the first of the great turning movements which Lee and Jackson were to carry through to brilliant success so often. "Look at the red blaze beyond those bushes," said Dalton, "and listen how rapidly the sound of battle is growing in volume. I don't know where we are, but I do know now that old Jack is leading us right into the thick of it." The general rode forward and stopped his horse on the crest of a low hill. Then Harry and Dalton, looking over the bushes and swamps, saw a great blue army stationed behind a creek and some low works. "It's McClellan!" exclaimed Dalton. "Or a part of him," said Harry. It was a wing of the Northern army. McClellan himself was not there, but many brave generals were: Porter, Slocum, and the others. The batteries of this army were engaged in a heavy duel with the Southern batteries in front, and the sharpshooters in the woods and bushes kept up a continuous combat that crackled like the flames of a forest fire. Harry drew a long breath. "This is the biggest yet," he said. Dalton nodded. The soldiers of Jackson were already marching off through the woods, floundering through deep mud, crossing little streams swollen by heavy rains, but eager to get into action. It was very difficult for the mounted men, and Harry and Dalton at last dismounted and led their horses. The division made slow progress, and as they struggled on, the battle deepened. Now and then as they toiled through the muck, they saw long masses of blue infantry on a ridge, and with them the batteries of great guns which the gunners of the North knew so well how to use. Their own proximity was discovered after a while, and shell and bullets began to fly among them, but they emerged at last on firm ground and on the Northern flank. "It's hot and growing hotter," said Dalton. "And we'll help increase the heat if we ever get through these morasses," said Harry. He felt the bridle suddenly pulled out of his hand, and turned to catch his runaway horse, but the horse had been shot dead, and his body had fallen into the swamp. Dalton's horse also was killed presently by a piece of shell, but the two plunged along on foot, endeavoring to keep up with the general. The fire upon them was increasing fast. Some of the great guns on the ridge were now searching their ranks with shell and shrapnel, and many a man sank down in the morass, to be lost there forever. But Jackson never ceased to urge them on. They were bringing their batteries that way too, and men and horses alike tugged at the cannon. "If we ever get through," said Harry, "we're bound to do big things." "We'll get through, never fear," said Dalton. "Isn't old Jack driving us?" "Here we are!" Harry shouted suddenly as his feet felt firm ground. "And here's the whole division, too!" exclaimed Dalton. The regiments and brigades of Jackson emerged from the forest, and with them came 6 batteries of cannon which they had almost carried over the swamp. The whole battlefield now came into sight, but the firing and the smoke were so great that it seemed to change continuously in color and even in shape. At one moment there was a ridge where none had been before, then where Harry had seen a creek there was only dry land, but he knew that they were illusions of the eyes, due to the excited brain behind them. Harry saw the 6 batteries of Jackson planted in a long row on the hard ground, and then open with a terrific crash on the defenders of the ridge. The sound was so tremendous that he was deafened for a few moments. By the time his hearing was restored fully, the batteries fired again, and the Northern batteries on the hill replied. Then the mass of infantry charged, and Harry and Dalton on foot, waving their swords and wild with excitement, charged with them. The plans of Lee and Jackson, working together for the first time in a great battle, went through. When Lee heard the roar of Jackson's guns on the flank, he too sent word to his division commanders to charge with their full strength. In an instant the Northern army was assailed both in front and on the side by a great force rushing forward, sure of victory and sending the triumphant rebel yell echoing through the woods of the Chickahominy. Harry felt the earth tremble beneath him as nearly 100,000 men closed in deadly conflict. He could hear nothing but the continued roar, and he saw only a vast, blurred mass of men and guns. But he was conscious that they were going forward, up the hill, straight toward the enemy's works, and he felt sure of victory. He had grounds for his faith. Lee, with a smaller army, had nevertheless brought superior numbers upon the field at the point of action. Porter and Slocum were staunch defenders. The Northern army, though shattered by cannon and rifle fire, stood fast on the ridge until the charging lines were within 10 feet of them. Then they gave way, but carried with them most of their cannon, reformed further back, and fought again. Harry found himself shouting triumphantly over one of the captured guns, but the Southern troops were allowed no time to exult. The sun was already sinking over the swamps and the battlefield, but Lee and Jackson lifted up their legions and hurled them anew to the attack. McClellan was not there when he was needed most, but Porter did all that a man could do. Only 2 of his 80 guns had been taken, and he might yet have made a stand, but the last of Jackson's force suddenly emerged from the forest, and again he was struck with terrible impact on the flank. The Northern army gave way again. The Southern brigades rushed forward in pursuit, capturing many prisoners, and giving impulse to the flight of their enemies. Their riflemen shot down the horses drawing the retreating cannon. Many of the guns were lost, 22 of them falling into Southern hands. Some of the newer regiments melted entirely away under an attack of such fierceness. Nothing stopped the advance of Lee and Jackson but the night, and the arrival of a heavy reinforcement sent by McClellan. The new force, 6,000 strong, was stationed in a wood. The guns that had escaped were turned upon the enemy. Porter and Slocum rallied their yet numerous force, and when the dark came down, the battle ceased, with the Northern army in the east defeated again, but not destroyed. As Harry rode over the scene of battle that night, he shuddered. The fields, the forests, and the swamps were filled with the dead and the wounded. Save Shiloh, no other such sanguinary battle had yet been fought on American soil. Nearly 10,000 of the Southern youths had fallen, killed or wounded. The North, standing on the defensive, had not lost so many, but the ghastly roll ran into many thousands. That night, as had happened often in the valley, the hostile sentinels were within hearing of each other, but they fired no shots. Meanwhile, Lee and Jackson, after the victory, which was called Gaines' Mill, planned to strike anew. Harry awoke in the morning to find that most of the Northern army was gone. The brigades had crossed the river in the night, breaking down the bridges behind them. He saw the officers watching great columns of dust moving away, and he knew that they marked the line of the Northern march. But the Southern scouts and skirmishers found many stragglers in the woods, most of them asleep or overpowered by weariness. Thus they found the brilliant General Reynolds, destined to a glorious death afterward at Gettysburg, sound asleep in the bushes, having been lost from his command in the darkness and confusion. The Southern army rested through the morning, but in the afternoon was on the march again. Harry found that both St. Clair and Langdon had escaped without harm this time, but Happy Tom had lost some of his happiness. "This man Lee is worse than Jackson," he lamented. "We've just fought the biggest battle that ever was, and now we're marching hot foot after another." Happy Tom was right. Lee and Jackson had resolved to give McClellan no rest. They were following him closely, and Stuart with the cavalry hung in a cloud on his flanks. They pressed him hard the next day at White Oak Swamp, Jackson again making the circular movement and falling on his flank, while Longstreet attacked in front. There was a terrible battle in thick forest and among deep ravines, but the darkness again saved the Northern army, which escaped, leaving cannon and men in the hands of the enemy. Harry lay that night in a daze rather than sleep. He was feverish and exhausted, yet he gathered some strength from the stupor in which he lay. All that day they marched along the edge of a vast swamp, and they heard continually the roar of a great battle on the horizon, which they were not able to reach. It was Glendale, where Longstreet and one of the Hills fought a sanguinary draw with McClellan. But the Northern commander, knowing that a drawn battle in the enemy's country was equivalent to a defeat, continued his retreat, and the Southern army followed, attacking at every step. The roar of artillery resounded continuously through the woods, and the vanguard of one army and the rear guard of the other never ceased their rifle fire. Neither Harry nor his young comrades could ever get a clear picture of the vast, confused battle amid the marshes of the Chickahominy, extending over so long a period and known as the 7 days, but it was obvious to them now that Richmond was no longer in danger. The coming of Jackson had enabled Lee to attack McClellan with such vigor and fierceness that the young Northern general was forced not only to retreat, but to fight against destruction. But the Union mastery of the water, always supreme, was to come once more to the relief of the Northern army. As McClellan made his retreat, sometimes losing and sometimes beating off the enemy, but always leaving Richmond further and further behind, he had in mind his fleet in the James, and then, if pushed to the last extremity, the sea by which they had come. But there were many staunch fighters yet in his ranks, and the Southern leaders were soon to find that they could not trifle with the Northern army even in defeat. He turned at Malvern Hill, a position of great strength, posted well his numerous and powerful artillery, and beat off all the efforts of Lee and Jackson and Longstreet and the two Hills, and Armistead and the others. More than 5,000 of the Southern troops fell in the fruitless charges. Then McClellan retreated to the James River and his gunboats, and the forces of the North were not to come as near Richmond again for nearly 3 years. The armies of Lee and Jackson marched back toward the Southern capital, for the possession of which 40,000 men had fallen in the 7 days. Harry rode with Dalton, St. Clair, and Langdon. They had come through the inferno unhurt, and while they shared in the rejoicings of the Virginia people, they had seen war, continued war, in its most terrible aspects, and they felt graver and older. By the side of them marched the thin ranks of the Invincibles, with the two colonels, erect and warlike, leading them. Just ahead was Stonewall Jackson, stooped slightly in the saddle, the thoughtful blue eyes looking over the heads of his soldiers into the future. "If he hadn't made that tremendous campaign in the valley," said Dalton, "McClellan allied with McDowell would have come here with 200,000 men, and it would have been all over." "But he made it, and he saved us," said Harry, glancing at his hero. "And I'm thinking," said Happy Tom Langdon, glancing toward the north, "that he'll have to make more like it. The Yankees will come again, stronger than ever." End of chapter 15, part 2. End of The Scouts of Stonewall by Joseph A. Altsheler. Thank you for listening.